Okay, so today we're diving into some pretty heavy stuff. We've got this dossier, a whole collection of evidence, and it's all compiled for a very specific purpose, right? It's meant to argue, like actually argue in the International Court of Justice that genocide has happened.
Yeah, this dossier, it's a lot to process. It really is. And for this deep dive, we've gone through, well, a whole bunch of the sources that are like the foundation of this argument that's going to the ICJ. And it includes like a range of stuff, statements from Israeli officials from the top, like the president and the prime minister, all the way to their cabinet ministers.
And it doesn't stop at just what the officials are saying, does it? The dossier,
Wow.
it also has like perspectives from the military, so from the higher ups, the commanders, down to, the soldiers on the ground. And then it's got all these reports and findings from these international organizations and news sources too, right?
Exactly, yeah. So what we're trying to do in this deep dive, our mission basically, is to really grasp the core of this dossier. What's the key information that's being presented to the ICJ to actually back up this claim of, genocidal intent, and then the actions that are supposed to be like proof of genocide, right? It's like we're trying to get to the heart of the evidence itself.
Okay, so that makes sense. So let's start unpacking this thing. What's the first big category of evidence that the dossier uses to make its case to the ICJ?
So the first thing they focus on is statements of intent, like what people have said that might show they wanted genocide to happen, and then incitement, words that could push others to commit genocide. And there are a lot of big names, high-ranking officials whose words they're looking at.
Right, right. So let's talk about those high-ranking officials.
Okay, so the dossier, it brings up a lot of statements made by the Israeli president, Isaac Herzog. One that really stands out that they highlight for the ICJ is when he compares Hamas to evil, something that needs to be uprooted with no mercy. Then, of course, you have Prime Minister Netanyahu, right? He keeps calling for total victory and saying that Gaza can never, ever be a threat to Israel again.
It's not just like casual comments, are they? These are statements coming from like the leaders of the country. And then the dossier goes on to look at other ministers, like people in the security cabinet, the war cabinet, the war forum, right? Is that particularly significant when the dossier wants to show the ICJ what government policy is?
Oh, absolutely. Those are the groups making the big decisions. So, for example, the dossier quotes Yoav Gallant, who was Minister of Defense at the time. He's telling soldiers in Rafah to create military pressure, to kill terrorists, harm them, take prisoners, basically everything that needs to be done. I mean, that carries a lot of weight when it comes from someone like him. And then you have the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich. The dossier brings up his desire for Gaza to shrink and how he calls for voluntary immigration of Palestinians. And that's presented as evidence of a bigger plan, like an intention beyond just this one conflict.
From what you're describing, it sounds like the rhetoric gets, well, even stronger, even more explicit with some of the other ministers that the dossier talks about.
Yeah, that's true. You've got Itamar Ben-Gvir, the national security minister. He said there are no innocents in the Gaza Strip, and he even said this is really disturbing that the lives of Israeli soldiers are more important than enemy children. When you have someone in a position of power like him making these pronouncements, well, the ICJ could interpret that as evidence of a certain mindset, a prevailing attitude within the government.
Okay, so then the dossier moves on from these ministers to members of the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament, right? And some of their statements seem very direct, like straight up calling for destruction.
Yeah, and what's really striking, what the ICJ is likely to find important, is how explicit some of these calls are. For instance, there's Ariel Kalner, he's a Likud MK. He's quoted saying to erase Gaza. Then you've got another MK, Nissim Vaturi. He actually defended his own tweet where he said, burn Gaza. And then there's Galit Distel Atbarian. She was a minister, and she's quoted saying she wants to see Gaza flattened mercilessly. And then you've got another MK, Revital Gottlieb. She said to attack Rafah like we attacked in the north. And she even suggested like ignoring the ICJ and just following what the Israeli people want. From a legal perspective, when you have these really clear calls for destruction, it's a big deal. They can be seen as, indicators of potential genocide, like how it's defined in the Genocide Convention, Article 2.
It's chilling. Some of these statements, they use these biblical analogies like Amalek and Sodom and Gomorrah. Why is that kind of rhetoric particularly, I don't know, charged? Like, why is it so important when we're talking about genocide and the ICJ?
Yeah, the use of those specific biblical references, it's really significant because in some contexts, those references, they're interpreted as calls for total annihilation, like completely wiping out of people. So when you have political figures using that kind of imagery and they're talking about a specific group, as they're doing here, it can be seen as a strong sign that they want the utter destruction of that group, which lines up with the definition of genocide.
And it's not always direct calls for violence, is it? The dossier, it also points out these instances where officials use dehumanizing language.
Right, and that's a crucial part of this whole thing. The dossier gives examples of officials calling Palestinians human animals.
Yeah.
That kind of talk, it's so dangerous. We've seen it throughout history, how depicting a whole group as less than human, it can be a step towards or even an excuse for extreme violence and atrocities. The ICJ will likely consider how this language, it creates an environment where targeting civilians becomes, well, easier to stomach.
It's also pretty revealing that the Israeli state attorney, they reportedly advised against actually investigating these ministers and NKs, even with these statements they made about the assault on Gaza. So what might the ICJ think about that?
That's a really interesting point. The fact that legal authorities in Israel, they apparently didn't see a reason to even investigate these statements, even though they could be seen as inciting violence. Well, the ICJ could take that in a few different ways. It might suggest that Israel, as a system, tolerates this kind of talk, or maybe the ICJ will see it as a failure to hold people accountable, people who might be encouraging violence. And that could be important to the bigger accusations they're dealing with.
So moving on, the dossier then presents a bunch of statements and actions that are, well, they're attributed to military personnel, the soldiers. This section seems to offer a different perspective, right? It's from the people who are actually carrying out these operations.
Yeah, and what's particularly worrying, what the ICJ will probably really focus on, is how the rhetoric we've been talking about, the stuff coming from the political leaders, it seems to be mirrored and in some cases even amplified within the military. The dossier, it includes statements from high-ranking military figures, and they're advocating for some really harsh measures against Gaza, like imposing these strict sieges and stopping humanitarian aid from getting in.
Can you give us some specific examples of what these military figures have said?
Sure. There's Jorah Island, a retired major general. The dossier quotes him directly calling for a strict siege on Gaza. And he even suggests that they should tell the people in Gaza to stay and starve or to leave. Then you've got Reserve Major General Yair Golan. He reportedly said that Gazans should starve to death until they release the hostages. And Brigadier General Harel Kamfau, he's quoted saying to kick out all Gazans and then, build villas there. When you have high-ranking military officials talking like this, it can be interpreted as a sign that they intend to create these really unbearable conditions. It's a strategy.
And it seems like that dehumanizing language we saw from some of the officials, well, it shows up in what the soldiers themselves are saying, too. At least according to the dossier.
Yeah, absolutely. The dossier, it details a ton of instances where soldiers, like the boots on the ground, they're dehumanizing Palestinians. They use these awful terms like human animals, sons of Satan, or they just call them evil. And what's really disturbing is that this dehumanization, it's often directly connected in their statements to calls for just wiping out Gaza, destroying it, and everyone in it.
The dossier, it gives some really disturbing examples of this kind of language from soldiers.
Yeah, it does. There's one Lieutenant Colonel, Shali Sanker. He's quoted saying that he believes evil is deep, deep down inside everyone there in Gaza. And another one, Lieutenant Colonel Taltorn, he supposedly posted "Wipe out Gaza now" on social media. Then there's Major Asaf Reed. He's quoted saying that there is no such thing as good Arabs. And there are even reports of soldiers describing Gaza as having no man and no woman, no human being, but animals. These statements, they're coming straight from the people who are actually fighting there. That's powerful evidence, and it's really disturbing for the argument that's being made to the ICJ.
And it's so sad, we see those biblical narratives again, the ones the politicians were using, being used by the soldiers, too, to justify their actions.
Yeah.
Why is it so important for the ICJ to consider this?
It's really troubling, this recurring theme of soldiers invoking these biblical narratives like Amalek when they're talking about their actions. Because, in the context of genocide allegations, it carries a lot of weight. The dossier presents examples of soldiers filming themselves destroying Palestinian property, and they're explicitly calling for revenge using this biblical framework. It suggests that these ancient stories of total destruction are being used to, frame and maybe even justify the violence and destruction that they're inflicting.
So, the dossier mentions soldiers singing songs about revenge, calling for the erasing of names.
Right, and there's this one really graphic example they cite where a soldier is blowing up buildings and he's shouting, "Erase the memory of Amalek, take revenge on the Gentiles." And then there are these really disturbing reports of soldiers filming themselves shooting animals, and while they're doing it, they're explicitly talking about the biblical command regarding Amalek. It's all very suggestive of an intent that goes way beyond just targeting enemy fighters.
The dossier also includes examples of soldiers just straight up calling for extermination, for killing all Palestinians. And they make these sweeping statements that there are no innocents in Gaza. How does the ICJ usually view generalizations like that?
When you have these sweeping generalizations, especially when we're talking about military operations and when there are already allegations of widespread harm to civilians, they're taken extremely seriously. The dossier includes a quote from Colonel Gur Rosenblatt, where he says that the operation should be completely random and that human animals have to pay a heavy price. And then there's Major Hagar Amar. He's quoted saying this horrible thing: "There is not a single male human or female human in Gaza. There are only those destined to die." Statements like that, they deny the basic humanity and the right to life of an entire population. That's really powerful evidence, very damning, for the argument of genocide that's being presented to the ICJ.
Beyond the immediate violence, the dehumanizing language, the dossier also talks about this idea of intentionally eliminating Palestinian identity, like getting rid of their culture. Why is that important to the legal definition of genocide?
Well, under the Genocide Convention, Article 2, the intent to destroy a group as such is a key part of the legal definition of genocide. And that means not just physically wiping out the group, but also doing things that aim to destroy their culture, their social structure, their national identity. The dossier gives examples of soldiers saying they want to eliminate symbols of Palestinian identity to make it impossible for them to, rebuild their society in the future. This includes purposely destroying universities, cultural places, and infrastructure that's essential for Palestinian life and society to continue. And then they include statements where soldiers say they don't want Gazan residents to have any rights in the future.
Yeah, the example of the destruction of Al-Azhar University, that one is particularly upsetting.
It really is. The dossier highlights these reports, it's really troubling, of soldiers filming themselves destroying Al-Azhar University. It's a major center of Palestinian learning and culture. And in the captions they're writing on these videos, they're saying this is the end of education there. And then there's Major Asaf Reed, he's quoted, talking about the total destruction of governance symbols and national sites. And another officer, Major Evanom Goldman, he says that the Gaza Strip needs to be reconquered completely. And then he says this chilling thing, that everyone who lives in the Strip is a potential murderer. These examples, they directly point to an intent to destroy the foundations of Palestinian society, to eliminate their culture.
So the next section of the dossier focuses on creating what they call unbearable living conditions. How does that, purposely making life terrible, how does that factor into the arguments about genocide that they're making to the ICJ?
So the argument is that intentionally creating these awful living conditions, doing it through things like sieges, restricting essential aid, and just widespread destruction of infrastructure, well, it's another way to try and physically destroy a protected group. And that makes it a really important part of the legal argument for genocide. They're saying these actions are not just some unfortunate side effect of conflict, they're a deliberate policy. And the intention is to destroy the Palestinian population in Gaza by taking away the basic things they need to survive.
And that declaration of a total siege right at the beginning of the conflict, that's a really important point that the dossier emphasizes, right?
Absolutely. The dossier highlights how Israel, right from the start, they declared a total siege on Gaza. They cut off electricity, food, water, fuel, everything to the whole population. Yeah, some crossings have been open sometimes to let in a little bit of humanitarian aid, but the dossier points to the fact that there are still a lot of restrictions, a lot of closures that lasted a long time. And they use that as evidence that this is a deliberate policy to make people suffer.
And the amount of destruction in Gaza, the homes, the hospitals, the schools, it's just massive. The dossier presents that as a key piece of evidence too, right?
Oh, absolutely. The dossier goes into detail about the destruction of Gaza's infrastructure. And it's widespread and systematic. It's not just random. They talk about huge numbers of homes being destroyed, healthcare facilities. They say 32 hospitals and over 100 ambulances were damaged, and schools, too. They particularly highlight the devastation in places like the Jabalia refugee camp in Rafah as examples of how bad the destruction is. And when you have that level of destruction, it has a massive impact on whether people can even survive.
And the impact on the healthcare system in Gaza, it seems particularly bad. The dossier seems to really focus on that.
It does. They point out to the ICJ all the restrictions on medical supplies getting into Gaza, how aid workers are prevented from reaching people who need medical help, and how they've reportedly refused to let critically ill patients be evacuated. They even mention that a lot of healthcare facilities were forced to evacuate, which made the already struggling medical system even worse. They're presenting all this as evidence that there's a deliberate effort to undermine the health and survival of the population.
And then there's the whole issue of forcing people to move within Gaza, displacing them, pushes them into smaller and smaller areas that are more dangerous. That's a big part of this argument about creating unbearable living conditions, right?
Exactly. The dossier talks about how the vast majority of Gaza's population has been forced to move multiple times into these shrinking areas. They emphasize that there's nowhere safe for these people to go. They point out that shelters, schools, even hospitals that were being used to house displaced people, they've been destroyed. It leaves people in desperate conditions, inhumane conditions, with very little food, water, sanitation, medical care.
The dossier actually makes a direct comparison, a really serious one, to what happened in Srebrenica. Why bring that up now in this context for the ICJ?
Well, what's really striking is that they explicitly compare what's happening in Gaza to Srebrenica. And the ICJ, they've already recognized what happened in Srebrenica as genocide. The dossier argues that what Israel's doing in Gaza with the severe restrictions on humanitarian aid, creating these desperate living conditions, it's like a form of slow death meant to destroy the Palestinian population. They even quote the ICJ's own finding in the Srebrenica case. The ICJ said that actions that create unbearable living conditions by restricting things like humanitarian aid, water, electricity, and medical care were part of the genocide. They're making this comparison to show that denying people basic necessities in Gaza, it could be seen as an act of genocide too, because it creates conditions that are designed to lead to the physical destruction of the group.
So finally, the dossier looks at what they call contempt for international institutions. What are they trying to tell the ICJ by including this category of evidence?
The argument here is that by showing contempt for international institutions, especially the ICJ and the UN, Israel demonstrates that they don't care about international law or accountability. And the ICJ could see that as further evidence that they believe their actions are okay, that there won't be any legal consequences.
Yeah, we've definitely seen and heard a lot of harsh words directed at these organizations from Israeli officials.
Oh, yeah, and the dossier has collected a lot of examples. They quote Prime Minister Netanyahu dismissing South Africa's case at the ICJ. He called it a despicable and outrageous attempt to besmirch the state of Israel. Then there's Gallant, the Minister of Defense. He said the ICJ's provisional measures were granting an anti-Semitic request. And then you have Ben Gvir, the National Security Minister, with his Haig Schmog comment, which got a lot of attention. And President Herzog, he even claimed that the court has Nazi-supporting judges. And then the foreign minister, Katz, he said that the UN has become an anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli body.
And it seems like this contempt, it's not just talk, you know?
Yeah.
They're dismissing the ICJ's rulings, too.
Yeah. Exactly, and that's important. The dossier highlights how Israel has publicly rejected the ICJ's provisional measures, saying these legally binding orders don't mean they have to change their behavior. And then when the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant, Israeli officials immediately reacted really negatively. They called it a dark day for justice and an anti-Semitic act. This defiance of international legal bodies, it's presented as part of a bigger pattern.
The dossier also mentions actions taken directly against the UN and its agencies as more evidence of this contempt.
Right. They talk about how they've reportedly banned the Secretary General of the UN from visiting the region, and they're making it harder for humanitarian aid organizations to do their work by putting restrictions on visas for aid workers. And then there's that plan they announced to dismantle UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees. These actions are presented as evidence of a broader pattern of hostility towards and obstruction of international efforts.
So taking all of this information together, all this evidence that the dossier has compiled, what's the big picture? What's the purpose of submitting all of this to the ICJ?
Well, the dossier, it's very carefully put together. They present evidence in several really important categories. You've got statements of intent coming from the highest levels of the Israeli government, along with the really disturbing rhetoric and actions of the military personnel who are actually on the ground. They detail how they've created what they argue are deliberately unbearable living conditions for civilians in Gaza, and they compare it to other instances of genocide. And finally, they show a pattern of contempt for international institutions and international law. It's all very clear. They're trying to build a strong legal case arguing that genocide has happened, and they're presenting it to the International Court of Justice.
Yeah, it's definitely a disturbing picture. Like you said, they're trying to convince the ICJ of a very serious accusation. The sheer volume of these statements and actions and the nature of them, it really makes you think about the role international law and what the global community is responsible for doing. If anyone wants to explore this more deeply, I highly recommend taking a look at the full filings that have been submitted to the ICJ, and you can follow the analysis from international legal scholars and human rights organizations. Thanks for diving into this important dossier with us today.